So I think pretty much all of us can identify at least one person who has fundamentally altered the way that we look at a particular piece of media. It might have been a book or a film or a game, and you encountered it through the critical insight of a friend, a reviewer, maybe even someone here on YouTube. And when you'd done so, you couldn't look at that thing in the same way as you used to. It might have been something that you didn't really care about and you come to appreciate it. Or it might have been something that you were really, really passionate about and you come to realize that there might be flaws or problems or other ways of thinking about this particular text. Slightly less common are the people who change not just how we think about a particular piece of media, but media generally. They don't just alter how we look at a film or a game, they alter how we look. This is a video about one of those people. This is not a critique or argument with them, although that's a perfectly fine thing to do. What this video is an appreciation and application of some of their ideas and interests, and hopefully a fun introduction for people who might never have come across them before. This is a video about the English writer and art critic John Berger. Some of the stuff that I say might seem a little bit obvious, but Berger's work has been incredibly formative in shaping how we think about the intersection of art and aesthetics and politics. And as Berger himself pointed out, if we don't understand the historical development of an idea, we're cut off from a variety of important resources that can help us to understand and act in our present moment. Coming up next, it's Looking at Art with Oxfordshire professor Sir Gerald Winstanley Fudge.
These are two of the last paintings by the great Frans Hals, icon of the Dutch golden age of portraiture. Each of the women speaks to us of the human condition, standing out with equal clarity against that enormous dark surface, yet they are linked by a firm, rhythmical arrangement. Subtle modulations of the deep, glowing black contribute to the harmonious fusion of the whole, and the detached strokes of the painter's brush reach a peak of breadth and strength. Hals's unwavering commitment to his personal vision enriches our consciousness of our fellow men and heightens our awe for the ever-increasing power of the mighty impulses that enabled him to give us a close view of life's most vital forces.
Thanks to Sir Gerald there for providing what I think is a fairly typical way of talking about fine art. For Berger, however, this was exactly what he criticised in his book and TV series Ways of Seeing. For Berger, the problem with what Sir Gerald says is that it reduces down the complexity and tensions of an image into nothing more than a universal and ahistorical concern with artistic form. There's nothing wrong with focusing on the form of a painting, however, but that isn't where the tension and drama of these images comes from. The images are of the regents and regentesses of the public almshouse. As Berger points out, Hals was extremely poor at this time in his life, dependent on public charity, and that same year that he was working on these portraits had been given some fuel, which had probably helped see him through a bitterly cold winter. The tension and drama of the image comes from that conflict between the need to depict these people honestly as they truly are and the artist's own struggle to move beyond seeing them as a poor person in relation to those who administer and give out public charity. Rather than any kind of harmonious unity, all Berger sees in these paintings is tension and struggle between the apparent universalism of painting as a form and the particularity of how we see them. What Sir Gerald and the rest of them who talk like this are doing is a kind of mystification. It's encouraging us not to see the historical struggle, not to situate ourselves within that historical struggle, but to reduce this material inequality down to an ahistoric, universal, artistic form. In Ways of Seeing, Berger points out that the tradition of perspective centers everything on the eye of the beholder, making the viewer the center of the visible universe. To quote Berger directly, the inherent contradiction in perspective was that it structured all of reality to address a single spectator, who, unlike God, could only be in one place at one time. This contradiction becomes far more stark with the invention of a new kind of technology that fundamentally altered how we look at the world around us: the camera. It was a technology that the Soviet filmmaker Dziga Vertov would describe like this.
I'm an eye, a mechanical eye. I, the machine, show you a world the way only I can see it. I free myself for today and forever from human immobility. I'm in constant movement. I approach and pull away from objects. I creep under them. I move alongside a running horse's mouth. I fall and rise with the falling and rising of bodies. Freed from the boundaries of time and space, I coordinate any and all points of the universe, wherever I want them to be. My way leads towards the creation of a fresh perception in the world. Thus I explain, in a new way, the world unknown to you.
The camera changes not just what kind of art is possible, but what it means to look in the first place. We see the entire world differently now. Before the camera, the work of art was singular. You had to go to where it was, to stand in front of it, to see it. But with the invention of the camera, the image takes on movement through time and space. All that was once singular becomes plural, viewable from almost anywhere, at any time, by anyone. Berger saw the art world's response to this change as essentially trying to create a bogus religiosity around the art image as somehow sacred, unique, special. It was, in effect, an attempt to maintain an undemocratic oligarchy. The art image could only be appreciated by those who could afford to go to the galleries to take in that high culture. If the age of mechanical reproduction had sent the image everywhere, then the art world responded by trying to lock away the image behind its closed and gilded doors. As art changed through the era of mechanical reproduction, the more the mystifications of Sir Gerald and his ilk tried to maintain that nothing had really changed. This was all an attempt to resist the transformation of the artistic image into something which was no longer unique. The reproduced image becomes something else. It can be placed into new contexts, seen in new places, associated with ideas and arguments that its original artist may never have considered. I mean, after all, that's what I've been doing throughout this entire video. The image becomes ephemeral. Rather than being unique and precious icons, the artistic image now surrounds us, like language does. So the question of how this language is used becomes a political issue. And if this new language of the image can be understood outside of the discourses of the Geralds of this world, then we might find new ways of situating ourselves in dialogue with them, understanding them as part of our historical continuum. We might find new ways of understanding ourselves as a collective and a class, and gathering the imaginative and cultural resources to assert the truth that history changed in unforeseen and revolutionary ways, and that it will do so again. So, to quote Berger, the image has become information, and thus, like all information, it is something that is exchangeable, saleable, a commodity. Of course, this is not an accident, but is tied up in both the development of a particular aesthetic form and the development of capitalism. What makes Ways of Seeing so interesting is the way that Berger connects political economy with artistic expression. But to understand this just a little bit more, we have to examine the history and tradition of European oil painting. Oil painting often depicts things which can be purchased. And if you were to purchase a painting, it's not unlike being able to purchase the look of the thing that the painting depicts. Given the expense in producing these things and the costs of being an artist, it's no surprise then that looking is not always a choice, but is often tied up with ideas of wealth and possession. What makes oil painting unique, for Berger at least, is its ability to render texture, to give the impression that everything within the painting is a real object that you could reach out and take hold of. Think of Holbein's 1533 painting, The Ambassadors, a painting in which every single surface, including the bodies of the two men, is covered with one thing: wealth. Paintings had shown wealth before, of course, but it tended to be the result of a rigid social order or divine favour. The wealth of the king was a reflection of the power of the state. But what works like Holbein's show is a new kind of wealth: dynamic purchasing power. A talk at the National Gallery given about the painting makes the point explicit. What The Ambassadors is notable for is Holbein's ability to render visible the subject's purchasing power. If the clothes of the subjects document wealth, so too does their environment. Between them are scientific instruments for navigation, and one of the globes charts the recent voyage of Magellan, who had set out to circumnavigate the planet in the name of Charles V, with the understanding that he would keep 20% of the profits and would run the governments of any land that they conquered. Navigation, colonialism, wealth. One of the books is a hymnal, and there's a lute as well, because to colonize means to convert in both the context of culture and religion. Whether the ambassadors depicted in the paintings were involved in these kind of colonial activities is a little bit beside the point, but Berger goes on to demonstrate the ways in which this relationship between possession and painting changed as the tradition advanced. As he puts it, merchandise became the subject of this kind of work. Where once painters had used gold leaf within their works, all of the gold suddenly moved to the frame of the painting, something valuable to surround and highlight the valuables that these paintings were depicting. It was the cultural reflection of an emergent capitalist class which had built its wealth on violence, slavery, and exploitation, and which needed a cultural form to lend their newfound wealth and privilege a degree of cultural legitimacy. So why does any of this matter? Well, as Berger pointed out, this tradition hasn't gone anywhere. It's just changed, and it still directly informs how we construct and understand visual language. The area of our life in which its influence can still be felt and seen most keenly is, according to Berger, publicity and advertising. We are surrounded by images, exponentially more so than when Berger was writing and presenting ways of seeing back in the 70s. And just like the oil painting tradition from which adverts draw, they too are projecting a kind of message. Whereas the oil painting was about showing the spectator, the viewer, what they possessed, advertising has a different kind of proposal. It's easy to think that we live in a system of choices. We can choose to buy this coffee or that coffee. We can choose to holiday here or there. It's easy to think that we exist within a system of choice. We can buy that coffee. We can buy this different kind of holiday. We can buy houses. We can buy cars. But Berger points out that pretty much all publicity, all advertisements are saying one thing: that we can transform ourselves by buying what they are selling. And they do this by showing us people who have been transformed and trying to convince us that we should want to be like the people that they show us. It's easy to think that this is a kind of anti-hedonistic way of thinking, but as Berger points out, publicity doesn't have a great deal to do with pleasure. What it has to do with is future possible pleasure, the possibility of pleasure when you have bought, pleasure that is endlessly and always just out of reach. As Berger writes in the Ways of Seeing book, publicity is always about the future buyer. It offers him an image of himself made glamorous by the product or opportunity it is trying to sell. The image then makes him envious of who he might be. Yet, what makes this self which he might be enviable? The envy of others. The glamour of the image depends upon envy, and thus publicity is about manufacturing glamour. Just as with the tradition of oil painting, the contemporary advert or publicity image is not really about the objects it depicts. It isn't about things, it's about social relations. If the oil painting was premised upon a cultural defense of private property, it rested upon the idea that you are what you have, and you could be both spectator, viewer, and owner all at the same time. In contrast, advertising and publicity rests upon a different foundation. It doesn't show us what we have, but shows us what we could become, and thus what we lack at the moment. We could transform ourselves. We could change our social relations simply by buying. And if you can afford to buy, then who even are you? Berger puts it in the final episode of Ways of Seeing: those without glamour become faceless, almost non-existent. The image promises us a transformed future if we purchase the object it wants to sell us. But there's a tension here because we know the conditions under which so many of these objects are manufactured and distributed. So the solution to that is that there has to be a degree of distance involved. The product, the thing that will transform us, has to be placed in a context that is far enough away from us that it engages our imagination, but not so far away that it seems completely unattainable. This isn't just about setting either. It could be about politics, a potential future world that the product wants to associate itself with. As Berger puts it, revolution can be wrapped around anything. You could even use real people. Put a revolutionary on a t-shirt. Use progressive values to sell razor blades, or the power of protest to flog Pepsi. In the 4th episode of Ways of Seeing, there's this incredible sequence where Berger flicks through a copy of the Sunday Times magazine. On one page there is an advert for Aramis cologne for men. On the next page there's an advert for pimps. On the next page there is a heartbreaking story about refugees from Pakistan fleeing to West Bengal. On the next page it's the home interiors section. All of these images, all of these pieces of text are put together within the same language system. And yet within that system, reality itself becomes almost unrecognizable. All of this that Berger identified in the 1970s has only accelerated. And this raises a really important question. If that contradiction between the promised idyllic future that would come through purchasing and the brutal horror of the world as it is ever more prevalent, and we're surrounded by images that underscore this divide every time we just open our phones and go on social media, then what do we do about it? How do we get through this? In the same year that Ways of Seeing was broadcast, Berger won the Booker Prize for his modernist novel, G. At the prize-giving ceremony, he caused a small scandal by saying that because of the organization's links to the exploitation of the Caribbean and its historical links to the slave trade, he would be donating half of the prize money to the London branch of the Black Panthers. The other half of the prize money was used to finance a new project, a small book documenting the experience of migrant laborers in Europe, done with his longtime collaborator, John Moore. This was the book called A Seventh Man. It's a strange book in some regards, a combination of visual scrapbook, theory, fiction, and economic statistics all smashed together into one singular object. For Berger, the figure of the migrant is central to understanding just how capitalism functions as a world historic system. For Berger, the figure of the migrant is central to understanding the totality of capitalism as a global system. If at the end of Ways of Seeing he was concerned with the dream image of capitalist society and the gap between that dream and its reality, then A Seventh Man is an attempt to get us all to wake up. The book is a series of Brechtian shocks to the system. It's designed to provoke us, to try and get us to look honestly and carefully at the systems in which we live and our own involvement with them. The figure of the migrant that is both hated and needed by capitalist production becomes a key figure in understanding just how these global systems that provide so much wealth and so much privilege can also carry with it such violence, exploitation, and displacement of people. We might think that looking is instinctive. After all, looking precedes language. But as Berger pointed out, looking is also a choice. And there are so many things which are trying to draw our attention. If Berger's work can teach us anything, it's that we can, if we're aware of those techniques that try and draw our attention and critical about them, we might find new stories. We might find new ways of looking at the world if we are prepared to be critical about not just how we look, but who we listen to. The book's reception in England was slightly mixed. Most of the reviewers tended to focus on the rather strange form. It's basically a leftist film essay that you can carry around with you. But in many other parts of the world, particularly Turkey, North Africa, Eastern Europe, and many other places, people loved this book. It was incredibly important. They saw themselves in its pages. They saw their families. They saw their fathers. They saw their experiences. Many in Europe, it seems, just did not want to look at who it was that produced so much of the wealth and security that they enjoyed. If the trends that Berger identified in the 70s strike us as true, it's probably only because they've expanded to the point of being obvious. That gap between the reality of capitalist expansionism and its constant desire for profit and the potential idyllic future of the publicity dream image is ever more stark. And as time went on, Berger became more philosophical. He basically stopped writing about England altogether, preferring to seek out and retell stories that were not being listened to, that weren't being seen in other parts of the world. He became more interested in what it means to be connected to a particular place. What does it mean to experience new cultures, new ways of living, and how will that impact the way that we look at the world? None of this is any less political. Of course, he wrote a huge amount about liberation struggles. His writings from Palestine in particular, I think, are really important and deeply moving. But this question doesn't go away. Of what can we do about this? In one of his later works, a book called Bento's Sketchbook, Berger puts it like this: I see the face of Anton Chekhov. The role of the writer is to describe a situation so truthfully that the reader cannot evade it. The question arises, how to do this today? To be someone who believes in a better world is in many ways to be someone who has to live with disappointment. The world that we live in can be incredibly beautiful, but also full of the darkest horror, exploitation, violence, and injustice. Berger answers the question from that challenge from Chekhov by talking about the role of protest, arguing that protests are not just a demand for a better future, but they are, in some small, maybe inconsequential way, about redeeming the present moment. The challenge, of course, is how do we live with that adjective of inconsequential? For Berger, the way to do that is through storytelling, to retell through narrative and to get closer through that process to what it is that is being redeemed in protest. That's what a storyteller can do, whether through image or through text or through both. Maybe that's an unsatisfying answer to some people, but one thing that's so powerful about all of Berger's work is that he saw the image and text as powerful tools for communicating and passing on hope. Given the ways in which capitalism is not just an economic system but seeks to occupy the horizon of the imagination and what is possible in the world, the passing on of hope is both necessary and deeply important. To quote Berger one last time, it used to be that hope was something that was found in triumphant Hollywood stories, but these have become obsolete. Hope today is a contraband product, passed from hand to hand and from story to story. To look at the world closely and honestly and to listen to what we find in the world is, in some way, to carry on that tradition of passing along the hope of a better world and to take on the responsibility of bringing that better world into being.
I feel that I'm a storyteller. That's all. That's all. Storytelling.
But the trouble with storytellers is they can be seen as very dangerous.
Well, dangerous to what and to whom? That's the question. If I am dangerous to those who run the new economic order, I'm proud of that.